Oh, hey there. It's great to see you again. Come on in. Let's have some fun. Hey guys, and welcome back to Raven Jade Diamond Paints. Who's ready for another Mystery Monday? Today, we're going to talk about the princes in the tower. Who's heard this story? Two young princes in Tudor England, locked in the Tower of London, disappear. Real quick, let's get into some housekeeping. We are still working on Arctic Wolves by Diamond Art Club and Robin Coney. I am using my beautiful pen that I got off of Amazon. I will link it down in the description box. And probably tomorrow we're going to see a pen stash video. Thanks to Jeremy for the idea. Who's ready to get into the story of the princes in the tower? So, the princes in the tower is an expression frequently used to refer to the deposed King Edward V of England and Richard Shrewsbury, Duke of York, his brother. The two brothers were the only sons of King Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville, surviving at the time of their father's death in 1483. When they were 12 and 9, they were lodged in the Tower of London by their paternal uncle and regent, the Duke of Gloucester. This was supposedly in preparation for Edward's forthcoming coronation. However, before the young king could be crowned, he and his brother were declared illegitimate. Gloucester ascended to the throne as Richard III. It is unclear what happened to the boys after the last sighting of them in the tower. Generally, it is assumed that they were murdered. A common hypothesis is that they were killed by Richard in an attempt to secure his hold on the throne. Their deaths might have occurred sometime in 1483, but apart from their disappearance, there's no evidence except circumstantial. As a result, several other hypotheses about their fates have been proposed, including the suggestion that they were murdered by their maternal uncle, the Duke of Buckingham, or brother-in-law, King Henry VII, among others. It has also been suggested that one or both princes may have escaped assassination. In 1487, Lambert Simnel initially claimed to be the Duke of York, but later claimed to be York's cousin, the Earl of Warwick. From 1491 until his capture in 1497, Perkin Warbeck claimed to be the Duke of York, having supposedly escaped to Flanders. Warbeck's claim was supported by some contemporaries, including York's aunt, the Duchess of Burgundy. In 1674, workmen at the tower dug up under one of the staircases and found a wooden box containing two small human skeletons. The bones were widely accepted at the time as those of the princes, but this has not been proven and is far from certain. King Charles II had the bones buried in Westminster Abbey, where they remain. Let's get some background information. On April 9th, 1483, Edward IV of England died unexpectedly after an illness lasting about 3 weeks. At the time, Edward's son, the new King Edward V, was at Ludlow Castle, and the king's dead brother, Richard, was at Middleham Castle in Yorkshire. The news reached Gloucester around April 15th, although he had been forewarned that Edward was sick. It is reported that he then went to York Minster to publicly pledge his loyalty to his new king. The Croyland Chronicle states that before his death, Edward IV designated his brother as Lord Protector. Edward's request may not have mattered, however, since, as the precedent of Henry V showed, the council was not bound to follow the wishes of a dead king. Edward V and Gloucester set out for London from the west and north respectively, meeting at Stony Stratford on April 29th. The following morning, Gloucester arrested Edward's retinue, including the boy's uncle Anthony Woodville, the second Earl Rivers, and their half-brother Sir Richard Grey. They were sent to Pontefract Castle in Yorkshire, where on June 25th they were beheaded. Gloucester then took possession of the prince himself, prompting Elizabeth Woodville to take her other son, Richard, Duke of York, and her daughters into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey. Edward V and Gloucester arrived in London together. Plans continued for Edward's coronation, but the date was postponed from May 4th to June 25th. On May 19th, 1483, Edward was lodged in the Tower of London, the then traditional residence of monarchs prior to coronation. On June 16th, he was joined by his younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, who was previously in sanctuary. At this point, the date of Edward's coronation was indefinitely postponed by their uncle. On June 22nd, a sermon was preached by Dr. Ralph Shaw, brother of the Lord Mayor of London, at St. Paul's Cross, claiming Gloucester to be the only legitimate heir of the House of York. On June 25th, a group of lords, knights, and gentlemen petitioned Richard to take the throne. Both princes were subsequently declared illegitimate by Parliament. This was confirmed in 1484. Good Lord, guys, I am having trouble talking today. This was confirmed in 1484 by an act of Parliament known as Titulus Regulus. The act stated that Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville's marriage was invalid because of Edward's pre-contract of marriage with Lady Eleanor Butler. Gloucester was crowned King Richard III of England on July 3rd. The declaration of the boy's illegitimacy has been described by Rosemary Horrocks as an ex post facto justification for Richard's ascension. So let's take a minute there and digest that. Can you imagine being 12 years old and arrested by your uncle and thrown into the Tower of London, supposedly so that you can be coronated, but he already arrested everybody following you to London, everybody that was there to take care of you. So now you're in the tower, your brother is there with you, and it's declared that you're basically a bastard because your father had previously been engaged to someone else. If that were true, half the people in the royal family are frickin' bastard children because everybody was engaged to somebody else at some point. That's just like how it goes. The ex post facto justification. So basically what they're saying is that the boys were simply declared illegitimate because Richard wanted the throne. He was power hungry. He wanted the title. Because, second born kids, back then they weren't worth a whole lot. Especially if the first kid survived. So, yeah. I don't know, guys. I don't know. So let's get into their disappearance, though. Ready? Dominic Mancini, an Italian friar who visited England in the 1480s and who was in London in the spring and summer of 1483, recorded that after Richard III seized the throne, Edward and his younger brother Richard were taken into the inner apartments of the tower, and then were seen less and less until they disappeared altogether. Mancini records that during this period, Edward was regularly visited by a doctor who reported that Edward, like a victim prepared for sacrifice, sought remission of his sins by daily confession and penance, because he believed death was facing him. The Latin reference to Argenitus medicus was originally translated as a Strasbourg doctor. However, D.E. Rhodes suggests it may actually refer to Dr. Argentine, whom Rose identifies as John Argentine, an English physician who later served as provost of King's College in Cambridge, and as doctor to Arthur, Prince of Wales, the eldest son of King Henry VII, Henry Tudor. There are reports of the two princes being seen playing in the Tower grounds shortly after Richard joined his brother, but there are no recorded sightings of either of them after the summer of 1483. An attempt to rescue them in late July failed, and their fate remains an enduring mystery. Many historians believe the princes were murdered. Some have suggested that the act may have happened towards the end of the summer of 1483. Maurice Keene argues that the rebellion against Richard in 1483 initially aimed to rescue Edward V and his brother from the Tower before it was too late, but that when the Duke of Buckingham became involved, it shifted to support of Henry Tudor because Buckingham almost certainly knew that the princes in the Tower were dead. Alison Weir proposes September 3rd, 1483 as a potential date. However, Weir's work has been criticized for arriving at a conclusion that depends more on her own imagination than on the uncertain evidence she has so misleadingly presented. Alison Weir, just a side note, is an amazing historical fiction author. So if you're into historical fiction, you need to check out some of her stuff. Clement Markham suggests the princes may have been alive as late as July 1484, pointing to the regulations issued by Richard III's household, which stated the children should be together at one breakfast. James Gardner, however, argues that it is unclear to whom the phrase "the children" alludes, and that it may not have been a reference to the princes. It may refer to Edward, Earl of Warwick, son of the Duke of Clarence, and Edward IV's two youngest daughters, Catherine and Bridget, all of whom were living under Richard's care at Sheriff Hutton. Evidence. Here's the evidence to support all of it, basically. What little evidence there is. Other than their disappearance, there is no direct evidence that the princes were murdered, and no reliable, well-informed, independent, or impartial sources for the associated events. Nevertheless, following their disappearance, rumors quickly spread that they had been murdered. Only one contemporary narrative account of the boys' time in the Tower exists, that of Dominic Mancini. Mancini's account was not discovered until 1934 in the Municipal Library in Lille. Later accounts, written after the accession of Henry Tudor, are often claimed to be biased or influenced by Tudor propaganda, because if the princes survived, it would threaten Henry's claim to the throne. 4 unidentified bodies have been found, which are considered possibly connected with the events of this period. 2 at the Tower of London, and 2 in St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle. Those found in the Tower were buried in Westminster Abbey, but Abbey authorities have refused to allow either set of remains to be subjected to DNA analysis to positively identify them as the remains of the princes. Rumors. Several sources suggest that there were rumors of the princes' deaths in the time following their disappearance. Rumors of murder also spread to France. In January 1484, Guillaume de Rochefort, Lord Chancellor of France, urged the Estates General to take warning from the fate of the princes, as their own king Charles VIII was only 13. The early reports including that of Rochefort, Philippe de Commines, who was a French politician, Caspar Weinrach, a German chronicler, and Jan Allertz, who was a recorder of Rotterdam, all state that Richard killed the princes before he seized the throne, thus before June of 1483. De Commines' memoirs, I am killing those names, guys, I'm sorry. Circa 1500, however, identifies the Duke of Buckingham as the person who put them to their death. Only Mancini's account is contemporary, having been written in London before November 1483. The Croyland Chronicle and de Commines' account were written 3 and 17 years later, respectively, and thus after Richard III's death and the accession of Henry VII. Markham, writing long before Mancini's account was discovered, argued that some accounts, including the Croyland Chronicle, might have been authored or heavily influenced by John Morton, the Archbishop of Canterbury, in order to incriminate Richard III, which again would further support Henry VII's claim to the throne. Robert Fabian's Chronicles of London, compiled about 30 years after the prince's disappearance, names Richard as the murderer. Thomas More, a Tudor loyalist who grew up in the household of John Morton, an avowed foe of Richard III, wrote the history of King Richard, around 1513, and identified James Tyrrell as the murderer, acting on Richard's orders. Tyrrell was the loyal servant of Richard III, who is said to have confessed to the murder of the princes before his execution for treason in 1502. In his history, More said that the princes were smothered to death in their beds by 2 agents of Tyrrell, Miles Forrest and John Dighton, and then were buried at the stair foot, meetly deep in the ground under a great heap of stones, but were later disinterred and buried in a secret place. Polydore Virgil, in his Angelica Historia, also around 1513, specifies that Tyrrell was the murderer, stating that he rode sorrowfully to London and committed the deed with reluctance upon Richard's orders, and that Richard himself spread the rumors of the prince's death in the belief that it would discourage rebellion. Holinshed's Chronicles, written in the second half of the 16th century, claims that the Tudor princes were murdered by Richard III. They weren't Tudor princes. They were York princes. The Chronicles were one of the main sources used by Shakespeare for his play Richard III, which also portrays Richard as the murderer, in the sense that he commissions Tyrrell to have the boys killed. A.J. Pollard believes that the Chronicles account reflected the contemporary standard and accepted account, but that by the time it was written, propaganda had been transformed into historical fact. More wrote his account with the intention of writing about a more moral point rather than a closely mirrored history. While More's account does rely on some first-hand sources, the account is generally taken from other sources. Additionally, More's account is one of the bases for Shakespeare's Richard III, which similarly indicts Richard for murdering the young princes. What are we thinking so far, guys? Do we think they were murdered by their uncle? Do we think they escaped? Let me know. That's your question of the day for the comments. Do you think they escaped? Do you think they were murdered? If they were murdered, who did it? And where are the bodies? In 1674, some workmen remodeling the Tower of London dug up a wooden box containing 2 small human skeletons. The bones were found buried 10 feet under the staircase leading to the chapel of the White Tower. They were not the first children's skeletons to be found within the tower. The bones of 2 children had previously been found in an old chamber that had been walled up, which Pollard suggests could equally have been those of the princes. The reason the bones were attributed to the princes was because the location partially matched that given by Moore. But remember, Moore stated that the bodies were later moved to a better secret place, which does not match with the bones being where they were discovered. One anonymous report was that they were found with pieces of rag and velvet about them. The velvet could indicate that the bodies were those of aristocrats. 4 years after their discovery, the bones were placed in an urn and, on the orders of King Charles II, interred at Westminster Abbey in the wall of the Henry VII Lady Chapel, a monument designed by Christopher Wren, and marks the resting place of the putative princes. Sorry, y'all. The bones were removed and examined in 1933 by the archivist of Westminster Abbey, Lawrence Tanner, a leading anatomist, Professor William Wright, and the president of the Dental Association, George Northcroft. By measuring certain bones and teeth, they concluded the bones belonged to 2 children around the correct ages for the princes. The bones were found to have been interred carelessly along with chicken and other animal bones. There were also 3 very rusty nails. One skeleton was larger than the other, but many of the bones were missing, including part of the smaller jawbone and all of the teeth from the larger one. Many of the bones had been broken by the original workmen. The examination has been criticized on the grounds that it was conducted on the presumption that the bones were those of the princes and concentrated only on whether the bones showed evidence of suffocation. No attempt was made to determine whether the bones were male or female, and no further scientific examination has been conducted on those bones, which remain in Westminster Abbey. DNA analysis has not been attempted. A petition was started on the British government's e-petition website requesting that the bones be DNA tested, but was closed months before its expected close date. If it had received 100,000 signatures, a parliamentary debate would have been triggered. Pollard points out that even if modern DNA and carbon dating proved the bones belonged to the princes, it would not prove who or what killed them. All right, let's look at the bones from St. George's Chapel. In 1789, workmen carrying out repairs in St. George's Chapel in Windsor rediscovered and actually broke into the vault of of Edward IV and Queen Elizabeth Woodville, discovering in the process what appeared to be a small adjoining vault. This vault was found to contain the coffins of 2 unidentified children. However, no inspection or examination was carried out, and the tomb was resealed. The tomb was inscribed with the names of 2 of Edward IV's children, George, 1st Duke of Bedford, who had died at the age of 2, and Mary of York, who had died at the age of 14. Both had predeceased the king. However, 2 lead coffins, clearly labeled as George Plantagenet and Mary Plantagenet, were subsequently discovered elsewhere in the chapel during the excavation for the royal tomb house for King George III and under the Wolsey tomb house in 1810 to 1813, and were moved into the adjoining vault of Edward IV's. But at the time, no effort was made to identify the 2 lead coffins already in Edward IV's vault. In the late 1990s, work was being carried out near and around Edward IV's tomb in St. George's Chapel. The floor area was excavated to replace an old boiler and also to add a new repository for the remains of future deans and canons of Windsor. A request was forwarded to the dean and canons of Windsor to consider a possible examination of the 2 vaults by either fiber optic camera or, if possible, a re-examination of the 2 unidentified lead coffins in the tomb, also housing the lead coffins of 2 of Edward IV's children that were discovered during the building of the royal tomb for King George III, and placed in the adjoining vault at that time. Royal consent would be necessary to open any royal tomb, so it was felt best to leave the medieval mystery unsolved for at least the next few generations. In 2012, a Leicester archaeological dig prompted renewed interest in re-excavating the skeletons of the 2 princes, but Queen Elizabeth has not granted the approval required for any such testing of an interred royal. So there's like 4 possible sets of bones, and there has been minimal testing on what's going on like who they are. DNA testing hasn't happened, so there's no way to know for certain that these are the princes. And that's why this mystery continues, because unless DNA confirms that any of the sets of bodies that have been discovered are in fact the princes, nobody's going to believe, like 100%, nobody's going to know that they're dead. Or that they were murdered. And nobody's going to know whether it was Richard, and that may never come out. So let's look into like the theory of Richard, and we'll see how far into this we can get. We may need a part 2 to cover this, guys. We'll have to see. So the theory of Richard III. Many historians conclude that Richard III is the likeliest candidate for the disappearance of the princes for a number of reasons. Although the princes had been eliminated from the succession, Richard's hold on the monarchy was very insecure due to the way in which he had attained the crown, leading to a backlash against him by the Yorkist establishment. An attempt had already been made to rescue them and restore Edward to the throne. Clear evidence that the existence of the princes would remain a threat as long as they were alive. Which makes sense. I mean, are you going to let somebody live if they're a threat to your power? Not back then. The boys could have been used by Richard's enemies as figureheads for rebellion, and they were. Rumors of their death were in circulation by late 1483 because nobody saw them anymore. But Richard never attempted to prove that they were alive by having them seen in public, which strongly suggests that they were dead by then. However, he did not remain silent on the matter. Raphael Holinshed, in his Chronicles of England, Scotland, and Ireland, written in 1577, reports that Richard, what with purging and declaring his innocence concerning the murder of his nephews towards the world, and what with cost to obtain the love and favor of the communal tie, which outwardly glossed and openly dissembled him, gave prodigally so many and so great rewards that now both he lacked and scarce with honesty how to borrow. Yeah, Old English is not something I've ever been good at understanding, but I'm pretty sure what he's saying is that, you know, Richard denied it a lot and like gave rewards to people if they could find them, which would indicate maybe they had escaped and Richard was trying to find them again. I don't know. Richard also failed to open any investigation into the matter, which would have been in his interest if he was not responsible for the deaths of his nephews. So he may have like offered rewards to people if they could find them or find out what happened, but he never opened an official investigation, which leads me to think he already knew what happened. Richard was away from court on a progression through the Yorkist heartlands at the time the princes disappeared. If they died at this time, he would have been unable to murder them in person. They were under guard in the Tower of London, which was controlled by his men, and access to them was strictly limited by his instructions. He could therefore have dispatched one of his retainers to murder the princes on his behalf, but it is unlikely they could have been murdered without his knowledge. This is the version put forth by More and Polydore Virgil, who both named James Tyrrell as the murderer. Tyrrell was an English knight who fought for the House of York on many occasions. Tyrrell was arrested by Henry VII's forces in 1502 for supporting another Yorkist claimant to the throne. Shortly before his execution, Tyrrell is said by More to have admitted under torture to having murdered the princes at the behest of Richard III. The only record of this is the writing of Thomas More, who wrote that during his examination, Tyrrell made his confession as to the murders, saying that Richard III ordered their deaths. He also implicated 2 other men. Despite further questioning, however, he was unable to say where the bodies were, claiming that Brackenbury had moved them. Shakespeare portrays him as the culprit, sought out by Richard after Buckingham demurs. This version of events is accepted by Alison Weir, and Hicks notes that his successful career and rapid promotion after 1483 is consistent with his alleged murder of the princes. Now, real quick, let's pause here and discuss why Henry VII would care who murdered the princes. And that is because he married Elizabeth York. So Elizabeth would want to know what had happened to her sons. Obviously, they were not going to be allowed to come out of the tower if they were in the tower, because they would be a humongous threat to Henry's crown. But Elizabeth would want to know, if she believed her sons were dead, who had murdered them. Henry would want to know that they were dead, or if he needed to be out hunting for them, because again, they were a huge threat to his crown, to his reign. So that's why that was important. Pollard casts doubt on the accuracy of More's accounts, suggesting it was an elaboration of one of several circulating accounts. However, he does not discount the possibility of it being just his own invention, pointing to the clear similarities to the stories of the Babes in the Wood. Clements Markham suggests that More's account was actually written by Archbishop Morton, and that Tyrrell was induced to do the deed by Henry VII between June 16th and July 16th of 1486, the dates of the 2 general pardons that he received from the king. Richard's guilt was widely accepted by contemporaries: George Cecily, Dominic Mancini, John Rouse, Fabian's Chronicle, the Crowland Chronicler, and the London Chronicle all noted the disappearance of the princes, and all bar Mancini, who noted that he had no knowledge of what had happened, repeated rumors naming Richard as the murderer. Rochefort, the Chancellor of France, named Richard as the murderer to the Estates General at Tours in January 1484. It also appears to have been the belief of Elizabeth Woodville, who would go on to support Henry Tudor in his campaign against Richard III. One possible motive for Elizabeth Woodville, subsequently making her peace with Richard and bringing her daughters out of sanctuary, could be that Richard had to swear a solemn oath before witnesses to protect and provide for her surviving children, which made it much less likely they could be quietly murdered as it was believed their brothers had been. In line with this contemporary opinion, many current historians, including David Starkey, Michael Hicks, Helen Castor, and A.J. Pollard, regard Richard himself as the most likely culprit. There was no formal accusation against Richard III on the matter. The Bill of Attainder, brought by Henry VII, made no definitive mention of the princes in the Tower, but it did accuse Richard of the unnatural, mischievous, and great perjuries, treasons, homicides, and murders in shedding of infants' blood, with many other wrongs, odious offenses, and abominations against God and man. The shedding of infants' blood may be an accusation of the prince's murder, but again, it's not clear. Hicks speculated that it was a reference to speeches made in Parliament condemning the murder of the princes, which suggested that Richard's guilt had become common knowledge, or at least common wisdom. Now remember, there were a lot of people who believed that they were murdered because there was an attempt to rescue Edward in July of 1483, and it failed. And it failed in part because they couldn't find him. Like, not just they couldn't breach the tower, they couldn't find him in the tower. And that's where they were murdered. That's where a lot of this speculation started. They have to be dead. They have to be buried somewhere. They've disappeared. And of course, if they were murdered, Richard III is the only one who has anything to gain by murdering them then, because Henry hadn't taken power. So why? Like, why would he let them continue to live? There's no reason for it. There are a couple of other theories surrounding Henry Stafford, who was the second Duke of Buckingham. Henry VII, obviously, trying to maintain his crown. Some other writers have also accused John Howard, the first Duke of Norfolk, Margaret Beaufort, Henry VII's mother, and Jane Shore, who was Edward IV's mistress. Pollard writes of these theories, none deserve serious consideration. The problem with all of these accusations is that they beg the question of access to the tower without Richard's knowledge, and overlook the fact that Richard was responsible for the safekeeping of his nephews. The Beaufort theory has more recently been supported by Philippa Gregory in her BBC documentary series, The Real White Queen and Her Rivals, but it is not supported by any evidence other than speculative possible motive. If you have not watched The White Queen and The White Princess, the Stars dramas, you need to. Those are based on books by Philippa Gregory. And now remember that they're historical fiction. So, there's definitely some leeway in there, but they do an amazing job of telling the story. Next week, we will continue this story, but for now, it's time for me to say goodbye, guys. See you then. Thank you so much for stopping by. It was great to see you. Remember to drink your water, wear your mask, stay safe. We'll see you next time.